Welcome back, everyone, to our potentially 10-day course. So, we've been through a few different things. We've talked about ways of reprogramming our mind, of ways to see the world slightly differently. And a lot of what we are looking at in this course is how to redesign our relationship with how we perceive reality in order to give us a more loving and gentle reality. A lot of mindfulness based therapies in psychology are based not off of getting the disease to go away. Let's say somebody has cancer or another disease. It's less about trying to get rid of the disease, which is our normal paradigm, and rather restructuring our relationship with the disease to see it as actually a part of us and to bring it closer to us instead of push it away. And what we see is in that space, when we redesign our relationship, then getting rid of it becomes not necessarily the priority anymore. And maybe it goes away and maybe it stays, but we're just not so worried about it anymore because we see it differently. So the power of restructuring how we see the world and how we interact with the world takes much more emphasis off of what happens and puts much more emphasis on how we receive the world. And when we receive everything, like in our last episode, when we welcome everything, it becomes less important if it's a sunny day or a rainy day because there's value in both and we're able to see that. So, having said that, today we're going to talk about time traveling and the value and benefit of time traveling. So, time traveling is this idea that when we were like kids, let's say, or even as adults, seemed really cool and really mysterious and really impossible and not realistic. And I want to redesign the way we see time traveling today to make it much more accessible. So, in order to do that, I'm going to share a cool story that happened not so long ago for me, and it was a very miraculous and interesting event. And from that, I have designed a practice um, to be able to develop our ability to time travel. Cool. So about a year ago in 2019, I was living on a community, and on my way, on the first day that I was supposed to arrive on this community, I was running a bit late and I was really anxious. And I was driving my car and I was super nervous that I was going to get there late and I wasn't going to make a good impression and all these things. And you know how anxiety goes. And all of a sudden, I just heard this voice in my head saying, "Hey man, everything's okay. Like, I see how everything turns out. I promise it's going to be perfect. Everything is going to be just fine." And when I heard that voice, I just kind of, I was like, "You're right. Like, I know. We'll be okay." And of course, everything was okay. And a few weeks passed once I got there, and everything was fine. And I was in a yoga class. At the end of the yoga class, we went into Shavasana, into corpse pose, where you just lay at the end of the class and kind of integrate everything that had happened. And all of a sudden, my consciousness got like pulled back to that moment a few weeks earlier when I was driving in my car, except this time instead of being in my body, I was like sitting right above my body. And I was seeing this 2 week ago version of myself kind of freaking out and being like, "Oh, I'm going to be late," and I'm feeling all this anxiety. And this new me whispered into his ear and just said, "Hey man, everything's going to be okay. I see how everything turns out. It's going to be perfect." And then I felt this whoosh of relaxation. And in that moment, I started getting crazy goosebumps. And I was like, "Oh my God, that was me. That was me now. 2 weeks ago, that voice that was speaking to that version of myself was right now." I was like, "Oh my God, time isn't linear. That we can jump back and forth if we know how to." And it's interesting because there's a wonderful movie that demonstrates this in a beautiful way if anybody's seen it, and if not, I would heavily recommend it. It's called Arrival. And the idea is that our language creates what appears to be a linear experience of time, but the truth is that that's just how we experience time. But if we change our language or we change our perception, then we can see that time isn't necessarily linear, and that instead of being a timeline, perhaps it's like this, and we can actually kind of experience all of life is happening at the same time, and we can manipulate and influence different experiences that we have. And that's the idea, is that everything's already happened. If we can go back and give ourselves advice and information from the future or from the past, we can actually alter our own timeline. So from that experience, which was very intense, and I didn't, I wasn't expecting it at all. I wasn't trying to have this experience, but all of a sudden my consciousness got pulled there, and it was very profound that I said, okay, cool. All right, well, let's just try and emphasize that time isn't linear and that we can time travel. Who knows? Whether that's the truth of what happened or not doesn't really matter. What matters is, what can we do with it? Is there value behind it? Is this useful? And if it's useful, how can we get better at it? So that's what I started playing with. So basically what happened was, I would sit in the evening and I would close my eyes and I would literally just say this: if there's any past self that needs me right now, I'm open. And I would just sit and wait. Sometimes I wait for 2 minutes, sometimes I wait for 5 minutes, sometimes I wait for 10. Often it wouldn't be more than 10, and I would get pulled back into a memory. I wouldn't try to generate a memory. I would just sit and wait. And what would happen is a memory would come. So for example, there was a time when I was really little and I had just started exploring my own sexuality and pleasuring myself and things like this. And I was like, 11 years old. And I remember I was in the living room, my parents came home, and I was so scared, and I hid behind the TV, and I was so scared and had so much shame for exploring my body. And I got pulled back to that moment with that 11-year-old self, and I just sat with him and I gave him this big hug. I was imagining I gave him this big hug, and I just said, hey, I love you, and what you're doing is so beautiful, and it's so awesome that you're exploring yourself. I know you're scared, and that's okay, and let's just take a few deep breaths. And that was it. I just took a few deep breaths with him, and as I was taking these breaths, I could feel his fear and anxiety and shame dissipating. And it was then that I actually realized that I right now had been carrying that timeline of shame for him. That was happening then. And as I was sitting with him and releasing that together, I was releasing the memory in my own body of that shame and guilt that was still residing somewhere in my physical body, and I was releasing that with him. And that started to show me the power of this experience, that I could go back to times in my life where I experienced trauma or shame or joy or anxiety, and I could just go sit and have moments with that version of myself. And as I started practicing more and more, I would have greater experiences. So for example, there was an evening right before, when I was 18, I left the United States where I was born, and I moved to Israel. And there were so many times in my life where I didn't understand how that 18-year-old version of myself could have known how important that was for me to move to Israel. My entire life changed, and I grew so much. It's like, how could that 18-year-old kid have known? And then it dawned on me, maybe I had gone back and told him how important it was. So playing with that, one evening, I just closed my eyes and I went back to the moment the night before I flew to Israel when I was 18. And I actually spent an entire hour laying down and talking to that 18-year-old self. And I was just like, first of all, like, I have so much gratitude for you, and thank you so much for doing this. You are so brave, and you don't even understand how exciting this is and how many amazing things are going to happen. And I saw, like, as I was laying with him, he was super excited. And he was just like, oh man, like, will you tell me some of the things that happened? I said, okay, I'll give you like a little bit, but you'll have to discover it for yourself. And so we were chatting and discussing, and I could just see his vibrance, and I could share with him the journey that was about to unfold in order to encourage him to feel strong in his decision. And I realized that at that time, I didn't know that happened, but maybe that did happen. Because ultimately, my memory is just my recollection of what happened, but we can alter this all the time. And so I altered my timeline. I sat with him and gave him the boost of, you should do this. And that was an encouragement for him in that moment, or how I remember that moment, in order to encourage him to do that. So that's one way we can use this, is we can go into the past we all have moments, defining moments of our life that we can go back into. They're just waiting a moment before we got in a car accident, where now we have the wisdom to see how it unfolded. We can go back to that moment and say, hey, everything's going to be okay. And we can also go into the future. Now, what's interesting about the future is because it hasn't happened yet, it doesn't mean what we're visualizing in the future is going to happen for us. It might split off into another timeline, and a different version of us might experience it. So, for example, when I go into the future and ask any future self, I'll say, hey, can any future self come in and give me some love or advice right now? And it's almost always the exact same. The advice is almost everything's going to be okay. I'm always watching out for you. I'm always guiding you. And what I believe to be intuition is my future self guiding me, because he can see what happens. He can see what I'm experiencing after it's already unfolded. He can see the entire timeline. And whether that's what intuition is or not, that's just how I view intuition. And it can be a very powerful tool when we can start communicating with these past and future selves. Then ultimately, like real talk, ultimately what it does is it just brings more calmness and compassion and easefulness into our life. Whenever I'm feeling anxiety, I call in a future self. The future self just gives me some love, and then I feel better. So essentially, it just allows us to restructure our relationship with anxiety and fear, and it's a tool to help us let go of that. So whether this is real or true doesn't matter so much. It's less important if I'm actually time traveling. Rather, the benefits I'm getting from them are much less anxiety, much more trust, much more love, much less depression, much less fear. So why not use the practice if it works? If it doesn't work for you, then don't use it. But if there's another practice that helps you in letting go of anxiety, then use that. That's believing in God, believing in heaven, believing in reincarnation. It's much less important to prove that reincarnation is the truth. Rather, and there's benefit in that. There's benefit in trying to figure out if things are true and real. But if we are so reliant on that game, then we miss the benefit that's just right there. If reincarnation is helping you in your daily life, then use it. Why not? It doesn't really matter. Whatever happens after, but what's serving you right now? And this practice is a wonderful practice that can serve you right now. So for another example of how we can start using this, it's quite interesting. So for example, if I'm about to give a presentation, or I'm about to give a talk, or I'm about to do something that I'm a little bit nervous about, I'll close my eyes before the experience and I'll say, okay, any future self, please, this one's really tricky to explain, but I'll connect in with the closest future self in linear time that is already past the experience and has seen what happens and is calm. So I'll say, okay, whatever future self is ready and sees that everything's okay, can I just chat with them? And I ask them to just give me some advice. And obviously the advice is always something like, hey man, it's going to be amazing. Or it may not work out the way you think it's going to work out, but that's okay too. And I promise that everything is feeding into something much bigger and much more important. So there's no need to worry. And I'll do that and I'll feel so much more calm, and it'll be really interesting because then I'll go give the lecture or I'll go give the presentation or whatever. And sometimes in the middle of the lecture, I'll take a deep breath and I'll realize it's me right now that was talking to him. Sometimes I'll get to that moment where I connected in and I'll be like, oh my God, this is it. This is the me. This is the me that talked to him. And in that way, I almost think of every moment that I check in is almost like a little lighthouse. And the more I have these check-ins, the more lighthouses that I can go back to. They're like moments in time that I pause, that I create awareness of, like, I'm connecting into myself right now. And any time in the future, I can go back to that. It's so much easier to go back to when I'm aware, which is why some moments in our life is really easy to go back to, because they're very defining moments where, when I say defining, I mean that we have presence in that moment, and we're present enough that they create almost like a little beam of light that we can go back into that memory. But sometimes, I mean, if you think of how much happens and how little memory we actually have of what happens, we're not always present. And so we can't go back to every moment of our life. We can only go back to the moments of our life where we have that presence and awareness. So this practice allows us more awareness of saying, okay, cool, this is a check-in point. And sometime in the future, I'm going to come back to this moment. And I'll know when that is. Or maybe I won't know when it is. But it's really cool when you start to know when it is. So there's a lot of things that develop from this, and it gets quite expansive, and it gets more and more bizarre and unique and mystical the more you start practicing this, the more you're open to this idea of time traveling, whatever that means for you, the more magic starts to happen. And there's some crazy things that starts happening. I have a memory of something that hasn't happened yet. Maybe that's what deja vu is I'm having a memory of something that I'm yet to experience, or a memory of something that a different version of me has already experienced, and this version of me hasn't experienced yet. So there are many applications for this, and there's much magic that comes with it, and it gets really exciting the more you practice and the more you develop this. You'll find your own benefits, and whether that's dealing with anxiety or fear or depression or not trusting, or you find other applications, try it on for size and see if this benefits you, and if so, then like hell yeah, use it. It's a really fun experience, and definitely watch the movie Arrival. That was my first opening, and considering that perhaps how we've been told and taught to view time isn't necessarily the way it is. That the system that we've been given, even though we've been conditioned into the system of viewing time as linear, which is why time traveling seems so bizarre for us, because of how it's been portrayed and how it's been given to us. We say, well, that's not possible. Well, it's actually just not possible in the framework that we were given. But maybe if we start practicing it, then we'll see that there are other frameworks that we can live our life by. And that's what I'm encouraging in this practice today. So I'll add a meditation, I believe, that goes with this, so that you can start practicing, and then you can practice on your own. You definitely don't need the meditation, but the meditation is wonderful if you want to lean on something that I've already created. So again, many applications for this and much wisdom to be held. Thank you for listening today. We're going to do two just deep inhales and exhales, and then we'll do 3 ohms to finish our practice today. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your openness. And if you're not open to this, hell yeah, thanks for listening. You definitely don't have to do anything that doesn't feel like it resonates for you, that all of these practices are offerings. And the more we can explore, the more we'll find offerings that match us. And that's the beauty of religion and philosophy, is that ultimately they're all leading to the same place, that all paths lead to the top of the mountain. It's just about finding the path that feels good for you. So find the path that works. Find the key that opens the door for you. And the more keys we have, the more likely we are to get into the room. And that room is freedom and enlightenment and easefulness in our life and acceptance and love. It's all the same. Presence. So let's take 2 deep inhales and exhales. And we'll do 3 ohms. Deep inhale. Taking a moment to sit in this resonance that we've created together. Taking a moment to let the mind go. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here today. Hari Om Tat Sat. Thank you for your practice. enjoy your practice, enjoy your time traveling, see where it takes you, see how far you can go, see how far you can push your own ideas of what this life is and just what can happen. See how open you can be. Thank you guys. Big love. We'll see you next week.